for individuals just in the spiel and moving on?
Yeah,
Trying to
tax
keep the
credits.
conversation.
Yeah, saying the spiel.
Now, is that because of all the
We can get into
examples
conversations
that
toward the end.
involve
You can always put that out there.
It
doesn't matter.
One with the longest.
Only one way.
Special.
When it's something like that is, of course.
I'm usually singled out and
I really appreciated your
Aside.
Single up part like it.
finally putting this.
it's like we gotta get rid of yeah.
Sorry, that was when the Annie was on, right? Yeah, she said this one
At some point, no, it's more expensive.
Are we set?
You're not gonna get your way out of it
Moderator,
just
what do you
simply
say?
by giving more density bonus. It's just not
Good afternoon.
straightforward.
Never been.
I'm Greg Powell, for those of you that have not met the others.
But I have an argument with increased density.
Yeah, and
We
I,
do
On
have
behalf of
five
the Urban
areas.
Land Institute, we welcome you
that's
to
what
the
it's the regional
fifth
discussion.
of 6 panels discussing the full process of how one goes about creating affordable housing. Those of you this morning that were able to be here heard a little bit from Mel Thompson, who is a principal with Grimm & Parker Architects, who are the architects for the first phase of Friendship Court, which you'll be hearing much about in the near future. And so he was kind enough to join his client, Ned, this morning, and you've seen some of their work. But the subject of the afternoon is designing quality housing affordably. And Mel has been kind enough to moderate, and I'm going to take my place and enjoy it.
Good afternoon, all. I'm glad to be here. It's a fun event. My name is Mel Thompson with Grimm & Parker Architects. Our mission at Grimm & Parker is to create together meaningful architecture and client success. And that creating together is what we took out of the meeting, the seminar this morning, is creating together. That's community, that's government, that's council, that's businesses, that's lenders. It's all the parts that create together the architecture that helps affordable housing and participates in affordable housing. Our first, we have a series of things that we're gonna talk about how you generate affordable housing. What are the moving parts of unaffordable housing? So first, we're gonna talk to Greg about unit design. We call it unit design 101. What are the key factors in doing efficient, affordable unit design for today's market, tenant, resident, owner, etc. So Greg, what are the cost-effective things that we devote into unit design and why?
So you may hear some jargon this afternoon. We're talking about units, which is what we all talk about, multifamily units. What we're really talking about are people's homes. And I think one of the important things about the discussion today is that we're creating the home environment for people. The reality of the relationship between what people can afford to pay for their units and what units today cost to actually construct, there's a very large gap there when you deal with other than market rate housing. But the needs are the same. You want to have a quality environment. If we're building for a long-term situation, we want to build something of quality and durability, sensible in maintenance. Sustainability is ever more important, and if we're developing new projects, we want them to be environmentally sustainable. So you've got all the same criteria that those of us that also do market rate housing have to focus on. The only difference being that the cost of rent or purchase of a new market rate unit is not achievable by folks in the lower income ranges. So the idea of building affordable housing is a little bit of a misnomer in that we can't build affordably, so we have to figure out how to make a great home for people that in the end is affordable to them. And that's part of what we've been hearing on the other session. So there's many things that affect the units that we design. The square footage is a big one. How big is the unit? Because there's a direct relationship between the cost of the square foot on the overall cost. That sounds obvious, it's not. It's not that simple. A smaller unit still has a kitchen, still has a bathroom. And so those are the most expensive components in the home. And in fact, bigger units are cheaper per square foot often than the concentrated smaller units. But size is something that we can play with. And Rush, I may ask to explain, we as affordable housing designers are given design guidelines, certain standards for livability that establish the unit sizes, depending on the numbers of family members and so on. Architects and other decision makers in creating the design of buildings have some elements that have some variation in cost. You know, building a stud wall is building a stud wall. We can't value engineer that. We can't reduce the cost of that. Finishes are one area, but finishes are such a small percentage of the total cost of a house or a home or an apartment. That we can influence that somewhat, but then there's a delicate balance between cheapening, and I use that word deliberately, finishes for cheaper first cost may not be the best value for the overall length of life of the unit, and it may not be the best decision for the residents. Same with systems. There are building systems that contribute. We say MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing is what, a third of the cost of a construction. I keep looking at Brian. Brian is a contractor, and he's going to talk real prices. But systems, and then equipment. You know, does everyone get a washer dryer? Hopefully so. You know, there are different qualities. You of the commercial market know that those vary, but not that much. We're not only designing homes, but in most cases we're doing multifamily, so we're really creating a neighborhood, we're creating community. So we as design folks are concerned not only about the quality of the unit, but the quality of its neighborhood, and we're going to talk about that, right? There's other elements that affect costs. Land is a raw cost, but it's also what you could do with the land which gets into zoning, and we may touch on that. So there are a lot of factors that contribute to the cost of a dwelling unit. And when you add them up, the result is that it's not affordable unless there are other creative things that we do. So the simple answer is we can't build affordably, sorry. And now we're going to explain how we get there.
Thanks, Greg. Staying inside the building, the next element and item we're going to talk about is accessibility and adaptability. One versus the other, new building versus existing building, retrofitting a building. And I wanted to ask Rush, what are the challenges that owners and operators have today with that issue?
So when thinking about accessibility or adaptability to the lifespan of a house, there are a couple of different things and approaches. You can, and a lot of grants and funding resources, so like Greg is saying, the things that make it possible to provide the affordable housing, a lot of them are looking for a lot of the components that would allow for aging in place, universal design, and so they look for things like zero-step entry, first floor livability, so having something that can be turned into a bedroom on the first floor, having a full bath on the first floor, roll-in showers and other things that maybe the family doesn't need at the outset, but thinking about the sort of legacy of that home, of being able to stay in their home long term, and thinking about those elements at the outset when you're designing the home initially. And that's one approach, and it's a really great approach it can be challenging, or more challenging than it might seem at the outset, particularly in conditions like we have in Charlottesville, where there might be topographical issues. So it's sometimes really hard to get that zero-step entry because of the slope of the land. And because also of the pressure on the cost of the land and the cost of development, we're looking for denser builds, right? And so that also often means that we're building more than one story. So a place like a more rural condition, or a condition like out in Texas where everything's pretty flat, building these great ranch homes that really provide this full first floor livability works, but it doesn't always work in the certain conditions that we're facing in our community. So there are other approaches as well that don't look at trying to have a single building sort of meet all needs, which is a lot to ask on an individual structure, but looking at some things, as Greg mentioned, that get more into questions around zoning and what policy might allow. So accessory dwelling units, that's something where there's a subordinate unit on the same lot, and that might allow for multi-generational housing or aging in place where the owner of the house ages out of being able to really maintain and keep the house. But by having that accessory unit, and there's a Habitat in California, a Habitat for Humanity in California that has done this, where in order to keep that family in that community and in the ownership position, the aging resident actually moved into the accessory dwelling unit and rents the main structure out to a younger family who needs that space. So there are a lot of creative solutions when you look outside of a single home, and you think too about how does the community support multiple opportunities across the affordability spectrum for people at all stages of life to really be able to find a place to move up but within their own community.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to move to outside the building and talk more about how the project fits within the community and what are the needs of the project to help it be successful as a part of the community. And one thing that we want to make an emphasis on as a major item is transportation, and how transportation is going to be, and parking is integrated in the project. And so I'm going to ask Andrew to touch base on those issues, and how the city can support that and help with that, helping the community.
Thank you, Mel. Yes, and one of the things that has been studied pretty extensively in this country is the notion that affordability based on the house cost or the unit cost alone is really a very inaccurate description of the impact on the affordability of the life of the person there. And in fact, the now recognized nationally term of affordability index is the combination of the housing costs and the transportation costs, which actually flips from what you would think. The drive to your qualified does not work. In fact, the transportation costs that are added to the life are actually outweigh the advantage that you get with the actual cheaper building costs because of, say, land or its remoteness. But there are other considerations when you're talking about the location efficiency, because affordability based on the lifestyle is sort of the context of where the family lives, and they need to have access to jobs, they need to have access to places for their children, and so they need to, dare I say, live, work, and play in a place that's accessible. If you are having to schlep a child to 9 events, it really precludes your ability to maintain your job as well. And if you have no income, you have a car that isn't as nice as some others, and it breaks down a lot. So if you're making somebody have to go and drop the child off at Mammoth's because you can't afford daycare close to where you work, and then you have to get back and drive to your work and then pick them up in reverse, and then there's soccer afterwards, if that's even possible, and you've got a bad car, your car doesn't make it. So offering, and what happens if you can only afford one car for the family and there are multiple people who need that, and the only way they can get someplace. So in fact, the affordability index that's written, they say, is even way more favoring the cost of transportation being hugely significant. And think about it this way, think about it from the support of the community. If you have this mixed-use places that seem to be where people want to go, oh yeah, we need a downtown mall, etc. Well, who works in the restaurants on the downtown mall? Can they afford to live here? How do they get here? Are they coming from 2 counties away? Sometimes yes. So all of these ideas really not only limit the life and affordability for the person, it also precludes the lifestyles that we all claim to want. Basically, affordable design is a place for everyone at the table, and we need everyone there to complete our place, and we don't need to spread them out needlessly. So the cost of affordability is really making better places and a place for everyone in it.
Great, that is so true, Andrew. Transportation and connectivity of all those parts is very critical. And also around the sites that we develop communities in, another key factor is green space and how that affects your life, health, welfare, for toddlers and seniors. We all need it. And so I'm going to ask Kathy, what should we be providing as green space and why in our community?
I hope you don't mind if I broaden that a little bit.
Could you use the mic?
We know Kathy in this community.
There's one
I
right
can't
there.
help but think multifaceted. It's because I'm trained as an architect, and you know what that means. So thank you everybody for coming. This is a nice turnout. I think what I'd like to talk about is what makes a thriving neighborhood. We have affordable housing, but affordable housing alone is not what a human being only needs. So you do need amenities. You do need green spaces. You need grocery stores. You need accessibility to work on walkable streets that are comfortable, that get you access to buses, to a wide variety of opportunities. So I want to just say that affordable housing in isolation does not create a high quality of life for people. It takes affordable housing within the context of a thriving neighborhood. So that means equity and viability, that means health and safety, and it does mean a sense of place. So when I look at that, I just want to throw out some little factoids here, because there's a geography to inequity. And when you look at where the highest poverty areas are in the city, they are historically our African American neighborhoods that actually have our highest concentration of affordable housing. When you look at obesity rates on children, 31% of African American fifth graders in Charlottesville are obese compared to 6.5% of white fifth graders. Diabetes is, in Virginia, is twice that among Black Americans than white Americans, and it's a leading cause of death. When you look at street design, the areas that have the highest pedestrian death rates are low-income areas because the streets aren't designed safely. Inadequate sidewalks, streets are too wide, traffic going way too fast, not enough blocks, not enough slowing down of traffic. And when you look at those streets, they aren't tree-lined. They aren't, I consider trees to be part of green space. They clean the air. They also cool the buildings, provided the buildings are not high-rises. And so taking all that into consideration, I will argue that to create an equitable community where all children thrive, you need to be as focused upon the design of your blocks, in your lots, in your streets, as you do about your housing. And the lot size, and I'll just end with this one, is related to zoning. When we have very large lot sizes in our neighborhoods, that precludes a lot of affordability. It precludes what they call the missing middle housing type, which many of our older cities had, and that includes anything from row houses and townhouses to multiplexes, like 4 units in a building, to these wonderful small apartment buildings that you see in places like Chicago, Boston, that are 4 stories, but they're H-shaped and U-shaped, so you get windows all around, but they could be up to 16 units. In our older parts of Charlottesville, we have that, but our current zoning does not allow that flexibility. It's very, very segregated by lot size and housing type. That is segregating us. It is isolating by race and class. That gets down to lack of accessibility to opportunity. And when you don't have a neighborhood that is viable, you can't create jobs. Everyone is dependent. So I just want to say that open space is critically important. It also is one of those two-edged swords. You put a park in, you put street trees in, all of a sudden the value of your neighborhood goes up. That to me is a zero-sum game, that we contend that an affordable neighborhood must be devoid of parks and devoid of street trees and devoid of amenities like good grocery stores. That is unacceptable. So we've got to find a way to create these thriving neighborhoods that everyone wants to live in, regardless of their class and their race.
Great, thank you, Kathy. And those are poignant comments. Gwyneth Parker has a project in Washington where in the 60s, several streets were closed, secondary streets were closed. If you know Washington, it's letters and alphabets and streets, and part of L Street was closed for a low-income housing project. But in closing that street, it literally cut off that community from a piece of the neighborhood. So we're redeveloping that project right now, and the city's planning to reopen that street. Reline that street with townhouses like it was in the past, to help make that connectivity again and put that tree-lined street back into the neighborhood. And moving on, I wanted to ask Mike, what other partners do we need in designing affordable housing as support services, agencies inside and outside the public realm?
Well, I'd actually taken that question a little bit different, but I'll try to touch on that before I speak to it. One of the things that's most fascinating, I think we've seen enough speakers here today, first of all, to see how this is all interrelated, because almost everything that anybody has said kind of touches on my subject. And so I've been a designer all my life. I've only really been in this affordable housing realm for months at this point. But one of the things I always look for as a designer were how many problems could you address in your solution? And so while our housing costs are relatively fixed, when housing can be co-located with services, there's just the potential of an incredible synergy and a win-win all around. Not only for transportation costs, if you're going elsewhere on your site as opposed to trying to take 3 buses to get across town for the service you might need, that's critically obvious, I think. And then density becomes a big issue. One, talking about lot cost and that, but from a service perspective, there needs to be a critical density to justify providing service. And whether that's in your project or in a finite community associated with your project, just so many of the services can really, they especially in a community like ours, they can't spread themselves but so thin. So while we're looking for dispersion of units, and there's good arguments to be made for that, there's also a critical mass that comes with density that allows services to respond. And that's that's the obvious services, to speak to your comment or your question. Certainly health clinics are something that we see in the city of Charlottesville. Every site we have needs to be more accessible to health. Certainly in the family communities, early childhood learning would be a very critical thing that would like to be a component. As I looked into the question a little bit, the growth of seniors in all of our communities is just going to be exponential in our lifetimes. And the more services that can be provided at multiple levels. And, that certainly, it starts with private services. So family and community are really just critically important to keeping people in their houses, keeping them out of assisted living facilities, which are much, much more expensive for a community to support. So lots of issues there. And then one other little point to be made just in my design hat, mixed use. If you're on a suburban lot, and as I look at our suburban supported housing projects in Charlottesville, we have underutilized community centers. It's difficult to program them. It's difficult to maintain them. So there's an opportunity there for services. But again, there's multiple community centers and you can't really spread the service out. I think they're in a denser, more urban building type. You frequently, for all the designers on the panel, the housing is kind of obvious, but you get first floor, ground floor units, partially submerged floor plates that really can't be used for housing. And it just provides a wonderful opportunity for commercial and institutional space that is supportive of the housing, in the same building. So those are my primary thoughts.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Mike. Those are good thoughts. A lot of these projects can't happen without services, especially when you get into the realm of assisted living or senior, even an independent senior building needs sometimes bus service or little shuttle service to get to grocery stores, to get to libraries. You also want to make the connectivity to local elementary schools and middle schools. Have some of the seniors go to have transportation provided to go to elementary schools to do storytelling, and then maybe kids can do a sing-along back at the senior building. So there are things that both all levels of education and age groups can provide to help and provide services. Then with that said, we will next talk to Laura about critical amenities. What's the best thing to put in affordable housing projects? Are they different? Is it different from a market rate project? And what are the general, is there a cost difference in the two?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to all of you for being here. So some of what I'm going to say is going to echo what Andrew, Kathy, and Mel have said earlier. And so I think when we think about amenities, I've talked a lot about this in other places, but I think that we need to start to prioritize safety. And I know safety can sometimes be a byword for policing or militarization of neighborhoods, but I think what we've seen in Charlottesville and what we've seen nationally is that pushing people out actually creates a more dangerous situation. And so when I think about safety, I think that the community I want to live in, the safe community I want to live in, is a place where people who need housing are able to have it, and it's stable, and it is suitable for their needs, that they have jobs that pay them well, that they have access to health care, and that they have the ability to achieve a really excellent education if they want one. And I will say that Charlottesville is a community that is able to provide all of these things. We have one of the greatest universities in the world, just down the road. We have a lot of space, we have a lot of creative people, we have world-class medical facilities, and we have the ability, I think, to provide jobs that pay really decent wages. And so when I think about safety, I say, I know that I'm most safe when the most vulnerable members of my community have those things. So when I know that people are not dealing in illicit markets because they have no access to jobs or because they have to trade non-monetary things for housing because they can't afford housing, that actually creates a very unsafe environment. And what I want instead is for those people to have their needs met, and that will make us the most safe. And so I think to get there, what we need to do is to start by talking to the people at the very beginning who need housing and ask them what amenities they want. Where do you want your parks? Where do you want your trees? How big do you want your streets to be? Do you want there to be roads going through your housing communities? And I really have to commend Kathy that when we had the people who came in from the Forum-Based Code Institute, they wanted to put a street through Friendship Court, and she really pushed back and said residents don't want that because there's kids there and it's unsafe. If you've got kids playing, you don't want cars driving through your community. So I think we need to start at the very beginning by talking to people who need affordable housing, even though it is sometimes inconvenient. And I think that there's been some pushback about TomTom, and that's because it is not possible for people working low-wage jobs that are often paid hourly to come in the middle of the day to a conversation about affordable housing, but we are talking about them, and they should be in this room and have the ability to say what they want and what they need. And so that means that we need to think creatively about community outreach, about the places that we do community outreach, what we call it, how we bring them in, and then build in accountability measures so that when people say, I don't want a street running through my housing community, but I want parking on the side, that we can say, all right, now we need to build in accountability measures so that it's not simply about giving you a space to say something and then having it disappear into the ether, but that we are holding ourselves accountable to make sure that those things happen, that we've got a way to keep city officials, that we've got a way to keep developers and other people accountable in order to build this. And that we also are making sure that people feel as though things are qualitatively safe for them, that they are not going to lose their job if they come to a meeting, or if they say, you know, we really need a childcare center because I have a lot of trouble with childcare. And so I think that there are a lot of amenities that when I talk to people, they talk about school choice. They want to be able to move into neighborhoods where the best schools are, and that we need to think creatively, as Kathy said, about zoning so that people can move into neighborhoods affordably where the best schools are so that their children can have the best advantages that our city's wealthier students have. And we also, in doing that and thinking about what these amenities are, we just have to start, I think, with the people themselves and make sure that we think about our history as a nation, we think about our history as a city, we think about the ways that race and class often map onto each other, and that we meet people where they are, and that even when they say things that are difficult to imagine or that we don't like, that we say, if the point of this is to provide something for a particular demographic, then that demographic has to be prioritized, and we have to start with them, that they're the experts on what they need, and that people can't assume that they know that without asking.
Yes, Laura, that is very true, because we've met with the Friendship Court community, and they're engaged in the process, and all of your comments are valid in what they need. We talked about a child care center, we talked about safe bus shuttles, we talked about safe and large play areas so they can accomplish what they need, seating areas outside, so moms and kids are gathering when they're picking up children in the afternoon. All those things are needs, and they're part of their daily life, and they're very important. We're gonna take a 2-mile view of the site right now and talk about development a little bit. And I'm going to ask Ned a couple of questions, well, one question really on how municipalities, how do municipalities get a process or a handle on how to acquire properties to help developers develop affordable housing in urban infill locations?
There's obviously a number of ways. You had brought up earlier the land banking thing, and that's another nice buzzword that's lying out there. But that is a culmination of all these processes. And as developers of real estate, and in our case, a mission-based developer of real estate, the one thing we have to remember is even though we have a mission, we're still a business, and we have to be a viable business, and we need certainty. So the idea of having site control is a big component. A lot of the processes we go for to pursue, one of the boxes that need to be checked on the list is site control. How we gain that site control in the private sector, we put it under contract and do normal things. When it comes to the public sector, it's a little different. Sometimes they have control of the property, sometimes they don't. So the idea of a land bank is saying, yes, they have control, and therefore we can transact. Often though that's not necessarily the case. So then that municipality has to basically come up with mechanisms in place that provides us the certainty that the transaction will move through, and those things involve foreclosure tax sales, which is a component, eminent domain and condemnation, which is something I think a lot of municipalities are not always willing to do. But when we talk about certainty of a transaction, we need to know that that is a tool in the toolbox for them, because if they aren't able to get it done through foreclosure, tax sale, or receivership or something like that, sometimes the rubber needs to meet the road, they need to take that next step to get it done. So that's really what it gets down to is just a certainty of transaction. We are a business, our investors are looking at it from a business perspective and want to know that there's a certainty for the transaction. And whatever tool is in that toolbox, every municipality has to be willing to do it and willing to be able to do it within a reasonable amount of time, because we've had deals actually that have been tanked because it got caught up in court processes and things like that, and we can never get control in time and the deal just tends to disappear.
Timely.
Okay, great, thanks, Ned, for that insight. Next, we're gonna talk about the constructability of a project, that's got a dollar figure to it. Be it $100 a square foot, be it $200 a square foot, the constructability of the building. We approach it at Grimm & Parker as thinking about the design and the constructability at the same time, to save the developer cost, because the simpler you make the structure, that's a big dollar item. So we tend to keep that simple and put the money in the building, so to speak. So I'm gonna ask Brian, how does the labor impact the design from your standpoint? What types of design make sense to do? Modular, panelized, see it built on site. We see different varieties of construction type depending on the region. Some things work well in Philadelphia, some things work well in Maryland, some things work well in Charlottesville. What's your input on that?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I think one thing that's kind of interesting is when people say affordable housing, associating it with cheap construction, and that's by no means the reality. In many cases, a lot of the affordable housing projects are as expensive or more expensive than market rate deals because of the contributing factors that go into a deal qualifying for affordable housing. And in many cases, that involves tax credits. So you have other agencies involved, whether it be HUD, whether it be VHDA, Earthcraft, and the components that go into complying with meeting the certifications often drive the cost of the structure higher than most market rate deals. If you're looking at a VHDA deal and it's got to be 100% brick on the facade of the building, well, obviously that's driving your exterior skin costs. A lot of the MEP costs on Earthcraft projects, if they're VRF systems, that's driving it at a much higher cost rate than if it was a typical multifamily market rate deal. So I think the word cheap construction, especially when you get into denser products, is not really an accurate statement. Something else that we see a lot is a lot of times the sites that are approved for affordable housing projects are either urban infill sites or redevelopment sites, or there's some reason why a market rate developer hasn't already built on that site. So we also tend to see that the site costs on those deals are much higher because, for example, one project we went in and did, we had to undercut about 7 feet to get the site back up to grade to where it was a usable site, and that's why it sat undeveloped for so many years. Or you have other sites where there's contamination that has to be dealt with. So really there are a lot of things that go into the cost of the building that has nothing to do with the actual quality of the finishes in the unit, but it's getting the site to a point where the site is developable. Checking all the boxes as related to Earthcraft certifications that are, Earthcraft Gold 300 points is a goal, but it also drives up the cost of construction in order to achieve that. I think on the modular component, I think that's an interesting product, which we've certainly looked at on the market rate side as well. But to date, we haven't been able to figure out a way to make it affordable. we run some cost scenarios on modular construction, and it was coming in at 22 to 25% higher than the standard stick frame construction. So I think the concept has value, but we got to figure out a way to bring the cost of the product down to make it a viable option. So.
Yeah, those are great points, Bruce. Brian, sorry. The earthcraft and energy components of projects today, the building materials that are required in those applications do add cost to the projects, and they're better buildings energy-wise and efficient, but those things drive up costs. In a market rate project, say for example, they could get away with a mechanical system of 12 SEER mechanical system in the apartment, but earthcraft may have a requirement where the SEER maybe needs to be 15 SEER, and that's a larger piece of equipment, a more efficient piece of equipment, and another probably 30% higher in cost. So those things play a factor in not making it less expensive to do affordable housing, because a lot of the requirements, all the other things in the building, you're still doing like a market rate building. You're still sealing the building like you have to. You're still providing bathrooms, kitchens, flooring material. All of those things are givens. That's in any apartment. So those costs do increase. Another item that increased cost is and I was speaking of energy, is energy. How affordable housing, the word afford, can we afford to do green and sustainable and affordable buildings? And I was testing Bruce with that comment on green impacts the cost as well, and what do we have to do, what are the needs, and what are the costs?
Thanks. It's good to see a turnout like this for this kind of discussion. Although it does look like an incomplete group, that there are this conversation located in another time, in another place, in another neighborhood, could have an entirely kind of richer sense of feedback. When we talk about sustainability, I think those of us who build, we're always anxious to build. We want to build stuff, and I think that fundamentally there are some other questions to ask before you start talking about how efficient your unit is, what your windows are, how much water you're saving, whether you have solar panels, and that is I think the really big decisions of whether we build or where we build. The most sustainable thing to do is to use the stuff we already have. And I think that's a really undervalued part of the affordable housing approach is what is there, what can be converted into housing, what buildings are there that are underutilized, what buildings can be, what places can be improved, what places become reconfigured or used for different purposes. Even the discussion that we have when we talk about zoning. If we, in one move in the city, if accessory units were allowed in every neighborhood, and the number of accessory units that were built by individuals, imagine that multiplied throughout the city, and imagine a couple of projects that didn't need to be built because there were affordable units in neighborhoods around the city. Then all of a sudden there's 2 or 3 projects of a couple of hundred units that you don't need to build. You don't need to use all of the energy, all of the materials, all of the effort, all of the disruption that happens in that kind of thing. So I think those kind of questions really need to be asked on a big picture. And then you start looking at the city and you say, or the area, and you say, we need to finish building the cities we have. And I think a number of you all mentioned this notion of building in places that are integrated with services, integrated with transportation, integrated with support services, places that you can walk. In developing the crossings, the crossings had a whole series of energy collection, energy monitoring, energy savings portions in them. But I think probably the most important decision we made from a sustainability point of view was going around with Virginia Supportive Housing, looking at various sites and choosing one that was in the middle of the city. And if you think of all of the resources, all of the transportation, all the cars, all of that stuff that people don't need to use over the life of that building, that's an extraordinarily important decision to make about sustainability. Then when you get, you're asking all of those questions before you even begin to talk about the envelope of the building, the systems that go in the building. I think we're getting to the point where sustainability is becoming so inherently woven into good building that it's no longer a kind of added attraction. It's something that is done just by good building practices, good insulation, good windows, energy monitoring. The technology is making these things much more affordable. And in our experience, there isn't really a kind of differential in cost in doing a good sustainable house or a good sustainable project than there is for not doing it. And that's across the board. Obviously, there are things that you can add to that that sort of increase the performance, or maybe the next step is from sustainability to kind of net zero to actually net positive buildings, where those buildings actually start to contribute to that. That might be the next goal that we're setting. I feel like we've gotten to the point where most of that stuff is inherent in what we do. That may not answer the actual specific question of the specific details of I call them gizmos, but it's kind of all of the stuff that you can do to make a building more efficient. That's all part of that overall process.
Great, thanks, Bruce. And one of the things that I noticed in town is the large garage across the street. What we're doing in the areas around Washington, a lot of the government facilities and garages are putting an entire array of solar panels on the top of that garage to minimize and reduce utility costs for, say, an affordable project or the area, which would then help drive some of the costs, utility costs down. Those sort of creative things which help communities.
Widen up the other. So that's 2 square blocks of downtown. So an even more out of the box thought is it would be a hell of a nice neighborhood. Imagine townhouses. How many townhouses do you get on 2 square blocks that happen to be half a block from the mall?
So you're gonna tear it down?
No.
Only solid.
We've looked at adding
2 more stories.
Yeah, they get a hell of a view. That's not it too.
That's your developer hat on. Next, we're going to touch base on, since I was talking about utilities and solar panels and things like that, I'm going to ask Sunshine to talk about utility allowances and how they can reduce resident costs, increase owner cash flow, but in general, reduce resident costs, which needs to happen in affordable housing. So, how do you touch on that, Sunshine?
Yeah, you were going to talk about that. No, I mean, I will get to utility allowances in the end, but I want to hinge off of the sustainability conversation because I think it's a really critical one, and it's kind of in my blood, my history, and the work that I've done in Austin previous to this. There's a long history of tension and conflict between kind of environmental advocacy and racial justice issues, and with few notable exceptions, of course. In the last 15, 20 years, there have been moments where the 2 levels of engagement come together, and you start to have what's called environmental justice. And from the perspective of how I approach affordable housing and how I approach all my work in Austin, and as we will continue this too, and here in Charlottesville, is I want to approach affordable housing as an environmental justice issue. So stepping back from that for a second, for those of you who don't know, LEED is a national green rating protocol that began almost 20 years ago now. And it started as a commercial-only program, focused just on commercial buildings. When LEED for Homes was developed back in the mid-2000s, and this is actually continued to today, the large majority of certified LEED for Homes projects are actually affordable projects. Most people don't know that, but more than 50% are actually affordable. And I'll get to why in a second. After that time, right before LEED for Homes was released, Enterprise Community Partners released the Green Building Protocol, specifically focused on supporting affordable housing. And so in the early 2000s, they developed really the first national scale green building protocol for any housing, but specifically targeting affordable housing. At the time, they actually, when you pursued achieving enterprise green communities, they actually gave you money. It wasn't just, they were trying to help cover those incidental costs. But it was the first real push, from my perspective, at bridging together, on the green building side, bridging together the environmental advocacy side and the racial justice side, bringing them into a singular conversation. In the integration of equity and green. So the Enterprise Green Communities has been through a number of iterations since that time. In the last version that was released last year, let me actually back up for a second. So the initial focus was across the broad spectrum, but energy and water were the focus, as are most green building protocols. LEED was certainly started in that way. It's all about energy and all about water conservation. In the last couple of iterations of Enterprise Green Communities, and particularly the last one, health has become the primary conversation point. Partially to some extent to what Bruce was referring to, which is that we haven't completely figured out energy and water, but we've come a long way. But health is an issue that is pervasive and is growing more and more of a concern for all of us, but in particular in low-income communities. So that as we think through sustainability, it's a critical piece here in the city. And then I want to talk a little bit about why LEED for Homes are mostly affordable projects, and the reason is because the principles of green building and the principles, at least in the nonprofit sector, around who we serve and why, they're essentially the same. From a green perspective, we're looking at issues of durability, issues of energy conservation, water conservation, how to minimize health risks. From an affordable housing perspective, all those are perfectly aligned. As generally speaking, nonprofits are long-term owners of housing. So for us, minimizing at the very basic level, minimizing maintenance costs, minimizing energy costs, minimizing water costs, help us sustain the property for the long term. And then further, as it relates to mission, we're there to serve the people that we're serving. And the more we can make their interiors healthy, the more we can reduce their utility costs. I'll slip that in there. Then the better it is from a mission perspective as well. And that's why you see that alignment between green building and long-term nonprofit affordable housing owners. The question of cost is one, the delta for certifying for Enterprise Green Communities 15 years ago when it first came out versus what it is now. The cost differential is pretty small. And that's largely because the industry has kind of caught up in many ways, and more designers and developers are conscious of how you have to think through the project from the very beginning, think about sustainability from the very beginning. And if you do that, you minimize a lot of your costs in the long run. So bottom line, the folks we serve, from my perspective, deserve the greenest and best designed communities that are available. For too long, it's been the exact opposite. So that's one way I approach it as an environmental justice issue. That being said, I do want to acknowledge that there is, in that conversation, there is always tension between the question of quality and quantity. Even though there are, it is not necessarily hugely more expensive, there is still some additional cost. And there is that tension that's always exists between that question of quality and quantity. So I don't want to set that aside. And then I'll just very quickly describe utility allowances. So utility allowances are essentially when we have an affordable housing project, the basic metric is that residents don't pay for more than 30%, that more than 30% of their income doesn't go towards housing costs. Well, when we have tax credit funding or any sort of kind of federal funding, we have to account for utility costs in that structure as well. So as an example, let's say 30% of a family's income would allow them to pay $500 a month for housing. Well, that has to include both rent and utility costs. So as an owner, we can only charge that rent portion that still allows them to account for the utility cost portion. If we're building green and we're reducing those utility costs, then we have the opportunity to kind of move that dial around a little bit and either potentially save the residents money, and or if we do invest deeply in green, it does cost a little bit more at the front end. From the owner perspective, we have a way to kind of get some of that money back so we can make that investment in the first place.
Great function, John. I'm going to ask Greg to help me with this last topic. Can design have? Can we do creative design in affordable housing with the sites that are left? For example, we were talking. Brian mentioned site constraints as far as, and we deal with this a lot. The sites that are left to build projects on are sites with issues. That's why they're left. They're sites that market rate developers know he's not touching because he's got to remove 10 feet of soil that's contaminated at $1 million for that effort. He's not incurring that cost in his cost. That cost is not in his number. So so we need to get creative on how that structure happens. Do we leave the soil there and go take foundations through it? There are a lot of methodologies to solve the problem, but they all have a dollar figure associated with it. But what do you find that are issues?
As designers, and tell me if you disagree, those of you that do this for a living, the more constraints and the more givens that we are given, I find the more fun and the more creative the solutions can be. So one of the reasons my practice focuses on urban mixed use is because of the complexity of dealing with urban infill, of dealing with existing fabric of cities and so on. I find that more stimulating, just having the fun of designing great places. That's a motivation. So if you can add technical complexity to it, through zoning and that, we have to deal with those kinds of technical complexities too. In the case of environmental contamination, just for that specific thing, there are programs that can help the public cleanup sites, for example. But in general, I think that the leftover sites that we have in the city, because we're, more or less built out, we've got to start looking for infill opportunities. I think that could be amongst the most creative, exciting, innovative designs of anything that we've done in the city. If it's flat and dumb and easy, it's not as much fun. And if you want to see what flat and dumb and easy looks like, go to suburban America and you'll find that it's not usually as creative. Just a bias.
That is very true. We've touched base on a lot of things here today. In closing, I want to. You have a comment, Kathy?
Oh, if I could just because I think when you're dealing with an older city, and a small older city at that, we're only 10 square miles in Charlottesville. The areas that have been identified as our growth areas, where we have our more mixed use zoning in place right now, is only about 1.3 square miles. So we have to be extremely creative, extremely strategic. The one thing that's pretty amazing about that is a lot of that land area is asphalt parking lot. It does mean we have to reimagine those places, certainly with the community participation, but those are areas that would not be displacing anybody. And it is an opportunity for us to really set some targets for affordable housing goals. We have 12 small area plans. The first one that we ever did was a strategic investment area. It's been slowly getting implemented, but the idea being that already had our highest concentration of affordable housing in the city at about 28%. But if you can imagine an area like the Hillsdale Hydraulic area, which is undergoing a small area plan right now, it's an old shopping center. It has 100 acres of asphalt right now. If you redevelop that at 21 dwelling units per acre, you'd get over 4,000 units, over 2,000 units. And then if you set a goal of 20% affordable housing, you've got then over 200 units that could be for affordable housing, over 400 units. So there are ways that public policy can be used. And there are ways that earlier today we talked about partnership. I do think the city government has to become much more aggressive in working with the development community, the nonprofit housing community, to be building that infrastructure so that streets with street trees that are well designed for pedestrians, bikes, and cars and buses are not viewed as a cost that needs to be avoided, are not viewed as a way to divide people, but actually to connect people. And if we get back to the city building that piece of infrastructure like it used to in the old days, I think we would be seeing a lot more affordability. Right now, developers are expected to be building the roads and putting that within their pro forma. So ergo, streets and trees and all that and great gracious sidewalks are viewed as anti-affordable.
Do you have any comments to add, Dave?
Yeah.
No, that's fine.
I do.
Go ahead.
Well, I like that conversation because it is really a partnership, but not just a partnership with entities like government entities or even nonprofits, but partnerships with the communities, because so often what gets in our way is, we are afraid of redeveloping hydraulic because of the traffic. But what people don't understand is the demand for the area is already the demand. And those people that can't afford to live here live in Greene County and Orange County and these kinds of places that are distant from us, which just mean that we have that much more infrastructure to handle the same amount of people. Whereas if we are able to give people who want to be here the opportunity to live here, then we can have transit-oriented development, which allows a greater flexibility in our lifestyle and having great places that we can commute. It won't just be the pedestrian mall. We'll have great places all over the area, so we have choices and more things happening in an area, and that requires the partnership with the community and the community to embrace that, because then when people have choices, the only way to reduce traffic is to get people out of the cars. There's no other way. Just pretending, just go away, isn't going to do it. We have to have alternatives. This has been shown all over the country. So getting back to tying these things together, it's a real cooperative effort for everybody involved. And we have the right and the obligation to dream big and create these great places, because that's what we want to have. We shouldn't say it's too expensive. Actually, we save money, we get the unique places that we already have some of, and we need to continue.
Great, thank you. That's all the comments we have for today. I would open it up for any questions that anyone in the audience may have to any of the panelists. Yes.
Actually, I sort of have a comment that I would like. Charlottesville bills itself as a world-class city, and I feel like we have been making better strides in the building trade and the building industry to become more energy efficient. But I feel like we should be aspiring for health reasons and conservation reasons to maybe consider the passive house building standard, which at the North American Passive House Building Conference in Seattle last fall, the big news is that for multifamily buildings, there is essentially no cost increase for building to passive house over code. And in this climate, it's double pane windows, not triple pane. It's 4-inch walls with 2 inches of mineral wool or whatever and cladding. And you can get to near net zero just on building to that standard. You add panels to the roof or whatever it is, and you have a chance to really make a change. And Virginia, partly I think because of Virginia, the Union power has dominated our government. We are behind the 8 ball until recently and going to alternative energy. But this doesn't even mean you have to get to alternative energy. You can build it in by building thermal bridge free, and reasonably insulated, not crazy. And I feel like Charlottesville should be taking a lead in Virginia to start building these really efficient buildings. You're making a 50-year investment. And who's going to benefit? The residents. Comfort, health, and low utility bills from day one, going into the future. And I just don't understand why there's misconception at the state level that it takes a year to get a passive house project certified. That's BS. You don't wait for the utility bills. It's all in the engineering right up front. And unlike LEEDs, passive house actually measures and holds you accountable for the energy you use. LEEDs is more about sourcing green things and not optics. All good things to think about. But I think you need to add on that extra component of aspiring to be better. Pennsylvania just added passive houses way to earn points for their tax credits. 14 multifamily projects that somebody in Charlottesville's energy radar on. We have the talent in this town. We have engineers who are passive house consultants. We have energy building raters. Yet, it somehow is not. I just feel like we do that, and we have a chance in this town because we need housing. Housing is going to get built. To do it right, we do it for 50 years, not short-term thinking. Great, thank you for the question.
I mean, just a quick comment. I think that if we go back to the big principle behind that is LEED and the way we've developed, the way we've gone about sort of culturally in America as approaching sustainability, we've tried to figure out more technology to add to our buildings to preserve the kind of spaces that we've had. Whereas in Europe, they've taken this approach of how can we minimize the demand before we ever do anything. And I think that goes back to that principle of how do we take an approach where we don't do, where we create something that we do less, that we actually have to build less, that if we're building buildings that don't demand energy, then we don't have to provide enormous energy systems to serve them. One of the interesting things out of the crossings is the engineering company that worked with us on the crossings. It's an engineering company that has worked with passive house standards for years. And Virginia Supportive Housing has then done 4 or 5 other multifamily units around Virginia. We weren't involved with them, but the engineering company was. So that Virginia Supportive Housing is actually using a kind of modified passive house standard for their multifamily.
Another question?
If you don't mind, I appreciate you all being here today. Thank you so much. And I have spent a lot of time recently in my own sort of mind and heart in thinking about this exact question of designing affordable housing and getting back to, talking to who will actually be living in that housing. And what I'm sort of realizing in some of the conversations that I have had is that those of us who are fascinated by architecture and cool cities and creativity, and we look at, even affordable housing complexes that have won awards, and they're beautiful, and we would want to move in there, but they're beautiful to us. And that I'm not sure that all of the communities that we've been talking to where we're envisioning affordable housing in Charlottesville have that same orientation, either and their standards of sort of beauty and utility are different. And I think that perhaps that's where some of the conversations have broken down in Charlottesville in the past. And so I'm curious when we're looking at, planning commission, city council, a city filled with amazing designers in all of those capacities, who then perhaps are presented with designs that reflect the beauty and heart of the communities who want to live there, but don't necessarily reflect what we might say is a signature city project. How are we going to grapple with that? Because I'm just feeling like that tension is beginning to exist in the conversations.
I can answer that. For example, we meet with communities in all the projects we do. The project's really designed around the community, their needs, their day-to-day wants. The architecture and the wow, all the architects locally are talented. I always say this, we're all talented. There are talented architects in Washington, there are talented architects in Charlottesville, there are talented architects everywhere. The goal is meeting the needs of the community, engaging them early on what types of units they need, what types of housing and residential components they need, what type of services they need. Those things, when you engage the community, they resonate hard with the community and make the difference. The architecture is the architecture. We're going to do a decent and nice building. That's how I look at it. It's that engagement and having the community be a part of that process. So they're a reflection of the architecture. So there isn't that disconnection. That's our goal.
Can I say a little more about that too? Talking specifically about Friendship Court, I'm an architect as well, so I have that sense of jargon and all that from my past. A lot of times, I think, when those kinds of conversations start to emerge, it's actually the issues are less about the actual designs or the buildings themselves or the placement of them. It's that the images or the jargon that gets used, walkable cities, bikeable, etc., are effectively seen as proxies for gentrification and displacement and white control, the white norms, white wealthy norms that control the concept of design in cities. So on some level, that's the first step, is to break that piece down. And I'm not going to say we're going to be 100% successful at Friendship Court so far, but in those conversations with the advisory committee, I think we've gotten past that hurdle. And when we're past that hurdle, when we've been going through the process right now of reaching out to the Friendship Court residents around with a bunch of different images about things that either different typologies, different layouts, open, closed, a whole bunch of different things, and ask people to kind of pick the things that they find most appealing. And it's not a rejection of the good design from a good design. Once you get past the sense of that we actually have a trust relationship, and we're not using those terms as proxy for displacement.
If I may add too, and I think we all are aware that there is a lot of tension and concern about high density and very tall buildings. And so when we have discussion about affordable housing where we're only talking about how we need more density in very tall buildings. Well, it's never been my experience working with our community, regardless of low wealth, middle wealth, or high wealth, that it's a given that high density tall buildings are desirable. In fact, we have a document in the Public Housing Association of Residents where their ideal, at least expressed in that document, is a 3-story building. So we've got to have some real honest discussions about what that so-called pro forma needs in order to get that affordability baked into the project and what is an aspirational goal of our residents. And I'm not going to be blaming or anybody on this discussion. We just need to have honest conversations about what is needed to make the pro forma work and how can we reach an understanding of what the residents want at the same time that creates the places that they call home. So I think that's been our discussions. Also, we're having discussions about form-based code in one part of our city where we're bringing in extra facilitation help so that we can get on site with our residents of our low wealth communities so that they can begin to drive the process, and also we all start having the same language to talk about it.
Sorry, I got me saying one more thing, sorry. The way in which we've started to bridge across that question of proxies, I keep using that word, but as Kathy was talking about as well, when we are in control of the dialogue and we're just inviting folks in to have a conversation, say, well, what do you want? Do you want this? Do you want this? Do you want this? There's a false sense of choice and a false sense of power in that conversation. So one of the ways that we have started to bridge and build trust with the residents of Friendship Court is by us giving up power in that process and really truly giving them to say about where we're headed. And giving them real choices. And that's fundamentally the only way that works.
Those of us that design and develop are in the business of change. It is basic human nature that change is something that people are apprehensive of. Even if it's positive change, it's change. I think that, and moving, by the way, is one of the most stressful events in any person's life. I think the death of a loved one, losing your job, losing your, I think moving is right up there in the top 5. So we're about to stress some of our neighborhoods. Designing something that feels comfortable and familiar from the perspective of those people for whom it is intended, I think is a very, very critical consideration when thinking about the character as expressed in the architecture.
I'd like to follow. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Just real briefly on that topic with regards to getting community input. I think a key factor and something that we've seen, especially in Charleston, is to make sure that if there are any structural issues with regards to displacement or relocation or feelings that their community has been taken over by a certain group or that their culture is being changed, that has to be addressed directly. Mm-hmm. So if you have a particular community that feels like that, you know, this was our community at one point and then this happened and now you're introducing something else, you have to work through all of the past issues so people can get to the level of trust. Because as you know, stated, change itself is hard, even if it's change really good, but you can't go, you have to just deal with it directly. And so whatever historical issues that a particular community has, you would just need to really know about it and have time for people to process, work through it so they can see a different future sort of like moving together instead of us against them type of situation.
One quick question. Well,
my question is actually about labor, and I'll just run as Mr. Revere, but it touches on many other issues here. Any project that gets HUD funding, of course, to the greatest extent possible, some of those funds through Section 3 are intended to be brought to members of the community through room funding. So my question is twofold. One, as a contractor, how do you approach some of the difficulties that can be found sourcing skilled subs for your projects? How do you kind of carry that? And kind of the same way that 12's here to 16's here. You know, the way some of this is the my subsidizing. And the second part of that question is, have any of you had success stories where a city or other groups have helped support and bring those skilled craftsmen to the table? So, start with Mr. Revere.
Thank you. That's a good question. I'll tell you, one of the more challenging things to do is to address the Section 3 requirement. It's a goal of a lot of projects. We do the best we can to advertise the project, to reach out to the municipality that we're building in, and in some cases those municipalities are able to provide us with directories where people have registered. We put it out through multiple different sources. But I can tell you it is a challenge when you're building a 60, 80, 100 unit building to try to find subs that are qualified to handle a project of that size, yet still meets the Section 3 requirements. So we see pretty good participation among the MBE and the SWAM subcontractors. But I tell you the biggest challenge that I see as a contractor is trying to drum up more subcontractors that qualify for Section 3 that are able to participate in these projects. One way is to look at breaking up a particular contract into several contracts so that you allow, instead of one painter to paint the project, maybe you're using 4 painters. The flip side of that is we also have a deadline on a lot of these jobs, especially if they're tax credit jobs, where it's the proverbial December 31st deadline where you're trying to get a CO and building turned over, yet the start date of the project may not be ideal. And so when you thought you were going to have 14, 16 months to build a project, you get the project and you have 8 months now to deliver the project. So, I would say if there was more flexibility sometimes on the tax credit side with this end of year deadline, it would allow more opportunity for some of that participation. But it is, Section 3 I would say is the toughest benchmark to achieve on these projects, just because, at least for what we're building, we tend to be building more of the 60, 80, 100 unit deals. So you do have to see how can you get a sub or multiple subs to do that project and still meet production rates of end of year deadlines.
That's right. So I just want to say Chicago has a really great Section 3 program. Claudia Weems is a Section 3 coordinator in Chicago. She's a great person to talk to. Cornelius Griggs is a Section 3 only contractor. So there are places that are doing this really, really well, and we can look to them as a model and for advice. But that's something that the Charlottesville Low Income Housing Coalition has been looking into. It's super important, and there are places that are doing it.
Great, thanks for that information. I'm going to close the conversation on a couple of notes. Thanks for having me. It's great being here. I always enjoy these sort of conversations. But we need to keep in mind that all of us in the room are here and are getting educated. This is an education for everyone. So the people that we're focusing on, so for affordable housing, aren't getting an education. They're not in this room. So we need to include them in this room to help them understand this process. Or in another room. Oh, in another room. To understand this process so we can make decisions together. This is a journey we're making together. Community engagement is critical. We have to have them in the room for these discussions because it's their community, they're part of the big picture community. And education is a big part of that. And world-class city, I've heard that term used a lot today. That term needs to say world-class city for all. You got a different agenda if you're doing a world-class city. It needs to be a world-class city for all. The cities that are successful include everyone, because everyone has to be included. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward in developing sites, other sites. Connectivity has to happen. The history of affordable housing and public housing has been disconnectivity. That's no longer our way of life. So let's keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Experts, and it was great engagement and great conversation.
Thank you.
Good meeting you.
We're gonna. Hi, right.
We're gonna, no.
I'm not done. You know the community is.
Yeah, I do.
We cannot move
We're gonna take a 5-minute break and then shift to the east. The Soundlands is in town.
And by the
So we're
way,
developing two projects right now, one of them high rises and one of them non-high rises.
I'm not into arguing about whether we need it or not. We need to convey to the community.
Well said, thank you very much. Good thing. For a neighbor.
We are getting it at Richard Pruitt right now.